Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Kavat. As the Gaza crisis shows no sign of abating, the international outcry to end the war is mounting. Tel Aviv declared war on Hamas in response to the militant group's attack on Israel on October 7th that killed 1,400 people. With me to discuss this are Deng-Ker Lee, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy professor and former dean of the College of International Relations, and Guermantes Lailari, retired U.S. Air Force foreign area officer specializing in counterterrorism, irregular warfare and missile defense. Professor Lee, Guermantes, very warm welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
Deaths in Gaza have surpassed 10,000 according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Agency. 4,000 of them are children. The UN and its humanitarian agencies, together with Arab states, are demanding a ceasefire. In Israel, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Tel Aviv to allow humanitarian pauses to allow refugees out and aid into Gaza. G-Man, let me come to you first. What do you make of the position the United States is in? Is it walking a tightrope?
Yes, it is, both internally and externally. So externally, Hamas, according to the United States, according to the EU, according to UK, Australia, Japan, and many other countries around the world, view Hamas as a terrorist organization. So that's a fact. Hamas, the acronym is actually means Harakat Muqawama Islamiyya, which means Islamic Resistance Movement. And in its charter, it calls for the destruction of Israel. It calls for killing of Jews. However, it's also in charge of Gaza. And so the problem is it was elected to be in charge of Gaza in 2006.
But that was a disputed election.
No, actually, it was a fair election, and the problem is the Palestinian Authority lost, and they kicked out the Palestinian Authority, and in some cases they killed them and took over Gaza. The thing is, a ceasefire is a defined activity. It means that both sides agree to stop fighting. What is going to be happening in the future, and it's happened in the past many times since 2001, Israel has stopped its attacks temporarily to allow humanitarian aid to come into Gaza, and in this case, to allow injured civilians to leave Gaza. There was an incident earlier this week or last week where an ambulance was used to transport a terrorist, Hamas injured terrorist, out of Gaza, so pretending to be a civilian. So there's all kinds of things happening under the carpet, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that you are an American Jew.
Yes.
I think the crux of it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a ceasefire would allow Hamas to regroup and therefore prolong the war, which is not what anybody really wants. But it's more the humanitarian crisis. Professor Lee, how many Gazans, civilians, have to pay the price, basically, for Hamas's actions?
The people in Gaza already pay too much, for the wrongdoing by the Hamas. But according to international law or international humanitarian law or international human rights law, it's very obvious that the Israeli government has committed or made mistake, right? That's according to the report issued by the United Nations. The Secretary General of the United Nations made it very clear that both sides should agree to a ceasefire. Otherwise, more innocent people will be killed, particularly in Gaza. And he also pointed out that, of course, he didn't point out the finger on Israel, but he made it very clear some people already committed crime in terms of violation of international law and international human rights law.
I would say just because the UN Secretary General says something about another country doesn't mean that in the Hague, where this would be decided officially by law, that he would be right. According to international humanitarian law and all the Hague and the Geneva Conventions, civilians will be dying in any kind of war. The difference are the belligerents attacking civilians to kill them, or are they attacking military targets and then civilians who happen to be nearby are killed? And that's the case of Israel. What Hamas is doing and continuing to do is launch missiles from Gaza into Israel. Luckily, Israel has Iron Dome and has shelters for their people. In the case of Gaza, the Hamas didn't build shelters for their people, and they have no way of protecting their people. That's why Israel asked the people in the northern part of Gaza to go south to avoid human casualties. The first act that Hamas did was slaughter civilians. That clearly is against international humanitarian law.
If you can address the refugee camp, so I understand that Israel had intelligence there was a Hamas commander there, but then, of course, for one life, there were dozens of innocent people killed. I also understand that the Biden administration has privately tried to encourage the Israelis, to use targeted strikes, to be more sort of precision strikes that may, limit the damage.
Right. So I think the numbers. First of all, I would point out, as you mentioned in the very beginning, that this is a Hamas. These are Hamas statistics. So one of the things that you might note is the fact that they don't say how many of the people that were killed were Hamas, let's say, fighters or terrorists, depending on how you view the conflict. In the last conflict in 2021. One of the interesting statistics that came out was that more than a quarter to a third of the people who were claimed to be civilians by Hamas were Hamas fighters. And of the quote, children that were killed, many of them were actually 15, 16, 17-year-olds, which are considered children by UN standards, but actually had guns in their hands, and they were recruited by Hamas. So the numbers are questionable. I agree that there are people, innocent civilians being killed, but I would say there's innocent civilians being killed on both sides.
Okay, let's move now, Professor, to Russia and China. What stakes do they have? This is actually Vladimir Putin who said this, a policy failure of the US in the Middle East. How have Russia and also China, how have they approached this conflict vis-a-vis their rivalry with the US?
I think both Russia and China share a similar view that the current fighting a war between Israel and Hamas would undermine U.S. influence in the Middle East, particularly in Arab world. And then secondly, if the war enlarged or engulfed the neighboring countries, it would be in the interest of both Russia and China to see that U.S. influence would further be undermined. Okay, because everybody knows that United States behind the Israel action, something like that. And I remember last March, China made a great effort, or it should be credited, to bring both Iran and Saudi Arabia to come together. And finally, they try to normalize their relations as a result. So, China try to take this opportunity, and maybe someday in the future, after the war, they can mediate, between Israel and the Palestinians. And if they succeed, of course, it greatly enhance China's reputation as well as their influence in the Middle East.
Right.
Earlier this year, China was able to get Iran and Saudi Arabia to sign, let's say, a quasi-ceasefire or a cease and desist arrangement where Iran would no longer encourage its Houthi rebels in Yemen to strike in Saudi Arabia or some of its groups in Iraq. It was not a peace treaty. It was not a formal agreement. It was just an agreement. But the big picture is that China, in my opinion, benefited from what is happening in the Middle East right now. Why? Because just prior to this event, Saudi Arabia, United States, and Israel were going to make a big announcement. And that announcement was that Saudi Arabia would sign a peace treaty with Israel, and furthermore, the United States would sign a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia, which would bring, let's say, Saudi Arabia back into the fold of the United States formally. But this event, the attack by Hamas, either delayed or canceled it. So that benefited China by not having Saudi Arabia becoming more close to the United States. But also, I would say that it damaged the Abraham Accords, which allowed Israel to have diplomatic relations with Bahrain, UAE, and several other countries in the region. So today, a lot of those countries are protesting what's happening in the Gaza Strip. But also, their action is stalling the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which would bypass Iran and go through Saudi Arabia, go through Israel, and go to Europe as a flow of trade between India and Europe. That has been delayed and nixed. It also, in terms of China, it bought oil from Iran at a very cheap price because Iran was under sanctions at the time. And during wartime, prices of oil go up. I think also that people around the world, especially in the United States, have a thing called war fatigue. They're tired of war. And they really are cautious about any involvement of the United States in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and possibly in a Taiwan Strait crisis. And so if a conflict were to happen in this region, people would sort of be more accepting of it. So these are all bad trends, I think, for not only the United States, but Taiwan. And finally, perhaps interestingly enough, all of the bad public relations that China was getting regarding its unemployment, its economy going down, is no longer seen as a front page topic, and instead it's the Middle East.
Professor, let's turn now to how Russia benefits. I assume that it would benefit because it's seeking a distraction from the war in Ukraine?
Of course. We know that the United States must provide more and more military equipment to Israel. At the same time, it also dispatch two aircraft carrier groups to this part of the area. And this would undermine U.S. effort to help Ukraine, okay? The first. And second, what mentioned that, another discussion, that the United States also provide a lot of intelligence to try to help Ukraine against Russia. But now, instead, the United States must dispatch some aircraft, try to pick up some information for Israel. So it would divide American resource, both military resource, also military manpower. So it would hurt its effort to help Ukraine.
And would you agree with Guermantes about that China largely benefits from the Middle East conflict?
Of course,
you also agree.
Yeah, China is in a very good situation. Try to benefit from this conflict, and the longer, the better for China.
Okay. A protracted Israel-Hamas war is more likely to spill over into a broader regional conflict, and analysts are weighing the impact on the US's ability to simultaneously arm Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel. I spoke to Mark Cancian, senior advisor with the CSIS International Security Program, to find out more. You've assessed whether the US can arm Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan at the same time. What did you find?
What we found was that, at least in the near term, the United States would be able to arm all three. The United States has just begun to send weapons and munitions to Israel. So far, they've only required three things. One is some additional missiles for Iron Dome. The United States had some on hand. The United States can accelerate the production. The Israelis also have asked for and received a lot of airdrop munitions, precision munitions, particularly two kinds. The issue with Taiwan is timeline. That is that as the United States sends more equipment to Ukraine and Israel, the timeline for providing equipment to Taiwan lengthens. So instead of maybe 2 or 3 years, it gets to be 3 or 4 years for those things that are produced for Taiwan. There's also authority to draw down U.S. stocks and send that to Taiwan. The United States has sent about $400 million already out of an authorized $1 billion. And there were certainly some trade-offs between what the United States needs, what the Ukrainians need, and then what we want to send to Taiwan.
Tell me a bit about how to manage those trade-offs.
Now, if the war goes on for a considerable period of time and the Israelis need more equipment, more kinds of munitions, then some of these trade-offs will get more severe. We'll have to see how that war plays out. There's also a question about Ukraine and what's going to happen there. The war has entered a stalemate, so the counteroffensive they've been launching is pretty much sputtered out. They're in a rebuilding phase, and the intensity may not be quite as great, but the needs long term may be large. When inventories are short, it will take several years to rebuild the inventories, and therefore there is risk with the United States, in the Western Pacific, and in Ukraine.
A country like China, obviously, which is threatening Taiwan with possible military action. How does China read this situation?
There's been a lot of speculation about how China reads the situation in Ukraine and Israel. One group of scholars believes that the United States is distracted and should focus on the Western Pacific. I think the majority position is that China is watching the Western response to Russian aggression, and that if that aggression is successful, that will embolden China to move against countries on its periphery, particularly Taiwan. And I think that that is more likely. And for that reason, the United States needs to continue its commitment to Ukraine, continue to supply Ukraine, even if there's some trade-off with the Western Pacific.
And lastly, Mitch McConnell has spoken about a new evil axis. This, of course, is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. What do you make of his use of this terminology, which, of course, draws on George W. Bush's axis of evil speech from 2002?
Talking about an axis of opposition, of adversaries, I think helps illustrate the challenge. There was a lot of pushback to President Bush when he did this, because the argument was that this made negotiations more difficult. But I think it pulls together the threats and makes it easier to fund them together, to treat them alike and not separate them out. Because if that happens, there's a risk that some might be funded, some might be unfunded, and that would undermine U.S. credibility worldwide.
That was security analyst Mark Cancian from the CSIS speaking with me earlier. Guermantes, Mitch McConnell mentioned the evil axis, and this was Iran, China, and Russia, which has echoes of George W. Bush's 2002 speech, where he talked about the axis of evil. There, he was referring to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. So, how much would you say the world has changed in the past 20 years, or has it changed that much?
So I would just want to add the fact that Senator Mitch McConnell further updated his statement and added North Korea to the list.
Right. Okay.
And so the axis is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to note that 2 out of the 3 countries that President Bush mentioned are still on the axis of evil list, Iran and North Korea. Mm-hmm. 3 of these countries also threaten allies in the Indo-Pacific, Russia, North Korea, and China. And furthermore, Japan is concerned about these countries, South Korea is concerned about these countries. And so maybe the location of the axis of evil has shifted, but behind them, the big countries such as Russia and China are still there. And I would point
still
out,
there, or they're new, aren't they?
They're new, but what was interesting was that when George Bush said that was right after 9/11, and China and Russia agreed to help the United States and to go after the Al Qaeda and the rest of the gang that was out there. In this scenario, it was not America that was attacked, but rather Hamas attacked Israel, and many countries didn't go along with going after Hamas for political reasons. For example, Russia is heavily entrenched in Syria. They're helping the Syrians with against rebels. They're providing weapons, intelligence, and furthermore, Iran, which is on the list as well in both cases, is helping Russia with drones. In fact, there's a quote that says that Iran is the main arms supplier of Russia for its war in Ukraine. So Russia is heavily involved in the Middle East, and Russia has always wanted access to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and now it has, for the first time, because of the Iranian relationship, it has access to that.
Okay, Professor Lee, let's talk about the Russian-Iran relationship. How has the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine, how has that shaped that relationship?
Well, both Russia and Iran are getting better and better in terms of their economic ties, political ties, as well as military ties. First, in terms of military ties, they need each other, or we call it they help each other. Iran needs high-tech military technology from Russia, especially nuclear technology, or long-range missile, something like that. At the same time, Russia needs a lot of another high-tech military equipment, but medium or even the ordinary military equipment, because Russia needs everything, especially non-manned aircraft we call drone, and some others. So in this case, in the war in Ukraine, it helped both Iran and Russia getting more close, and even reach a new high. I mean, in terms of their relations, they reach a new high. Really, they call it a very good partner.
Right. And how about this conflict now between Israel and Hamas? Does that mean that it goes to an even higher high?
Yes, they need each other, against. In case of the Iranian, very clear that if they help Hezbollah to open a new front against Israel, and probably it would result in American involvement in the war, and probably finally Iran will be involved too. In this kind of game, both Russia and Iran need each other, so they can jointly against the United States.
Let's talk about the evidence that we have of, as Professor said, of Russia helping the Iran-backed groups.
Well, it's known that Iranian pilots are training in Russia to learn how to fly advanced weapons, advanced aircraft, fighter jets. But specifically the weapons that Iran is providing Russia is the Shahed 136 suicide drones and the Mojahar 6 reconnaissance and strike drone. These are being used against Ukrainians. And just by the by, it's interesting for me to note that of all the people that are complaining about killing civilians, look what Russia is doing in Ukraine. They're killing tens of thousands of people. And Iran has killed their own people. Anybody who complains about anything about the government is put in jail or killed. And so the notion that again, the criticism is misplaced, in my opinion.
The Wall Street Journal reported that Wagner Group, G-Man, is planning to send air defenses to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And as Professor mentioned, Hezbollah, is one of Iran's sort of proxy militias and is threatening to open up a second front against Israel. Finally, Professor Lee, what is the likelihood of this conflict between Israel and Hamas spilling over into the wider Middle East?
I think the chance is still there. The chance is still there, but not very big.
Why do you say not very big?
Yeah, first, Iran is very concerned about its own national security. Really, Hezbollah also under heavy pressure from the government of Lebanon. If Hezbollah open a new front, then the Israeli army or air force probably would launch a very heavy counteroffensive against Hezbollah, and then probably the whole country of Lebanon will be under air raid, something like that. So the government of Lebanon is very concerned about that. Okay. And second, the United States, I mentioned earlier, has dispatched two very powerful aircraft carrier groups in that part of the world, and this is very clear. If Iran involved, then the United States would be involved. So the United States would deter Iran from getting involved. So I think the chance is not very big, but this one one factor should be taken into account is that how soon the war in Gaza will be end, okay, and then how many more civilians will be killed, because of fighting. The Prime Minister of Israel made it very clear that he tried to finish Hamas once for all, but probably how long, and how to do that, and that's the problem.
Yes,
okay.
I think that's what the fears are, isn't it? The reaction
Right.
Of the wider region. We're going to have to end it there. Professor Lee, Guermantes Lailari, thank you so much for joining Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.